Hello.
Hi. One note before we begin this discussion of death, according to the Watchtower and according to the Bible. Those of you who have seen the Daniel series, we ran to 29 segments, different videos, and we did promise near the beginning that there would be notes possible in PDF form. So those of you who would like the notes, they run to about 12 to 15 pages, if I remember. 5 studies that we did in a series back in the day called From the Covenants to the Kingdom, expressly developed for Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you would like the Daniel notes in PDF form, please let us know. In the comments we've received lately about both the Daniel videos and several other series, we've been a little concerned that there's a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses out there who seem to assume that the Watchtower's basic doctrines, their core beliefs, are accurate, correct, biblical.
Yeah.
But maybe they can't be trusted on things like prophecy, interpretation of prophecy, or even about their own history. But somehow they have the right interpretations.
Yeah. Now, when we left the Witnesses, that wasn't the way I felt. I felt that if I couldn't trust them on their own history and on prophecy, then why should I trust them on what they say about doctrines, main doctrines, teachings? So we felt we had to re-examine everything. We did that in the form of word studies from the concordance and started to read the Bible verse by verse.
Methodically.
We also went into the book business. So I did have a paranoia about anybody else. I didn't want to be fooled again, so I didn't trust Christendom. And I think I was still buying what the Watchtower told me about Christendom. So it's not unique that people don't make connections. Well, at least I didn't make connections quickly. But because we were in the book business, I started to see the tools that the church had, that I just couldn't believe what they had compared to what I had been exposed to as a witness. The depth of the information, that it's not geared to the lowest level of education, but some really
challenging stuff.
Challenging information and very in-depth. So I got over, thankfully, that paranoia about books.
And at the same time, we were going through key Bible books year by year. So we went through the complete
We went through Job and Genesis, because we were kind of doing the Bible in chronological order. But we also did Luke and Romans.
Within the first 4 years, I would say.
Romans was very valuable. So those things helped to overturn a lot of things that I just assumed the Watchtower got right.
So when we looked at the tools that Christendom had compared to what we were used to as food before, then we went back to the basic tools we had as witnesses, such as the reasoning book, and we were now we had new eyes, which was the stuff they're doing here is very shallow and surface.
Yeah.
For instance, I thought of the passage in the whole chapter here on death.
In the
reasoning book.
Yeah.
Even as I would have been satisfied when I was using that book as a witness that I had a fine tool in my hands, but when I re-looked at it after learning what Christendom had, I looked at, for instance, their definition of death, and saw something and noticed something I hadn't noticed before. How do they define death?
Okay, I will read it. Definition of death: the ceasing of all functions of life after breathing, heartbeat, and brain activity stop. The life force gradually ceasing to function in body cells. Death is the opposite of life. There's no credit given here as to where they got this definition.
So where do they get it?
I think a lot of what the Watchtower believes, they believe on the basis of human reasoning. That trumps everything else. Even a plain statement in Scripture. If it doesn't seem reasonable to them, they want God to bow to their reason.
So here you have what amounts to a biological definition of death, and something that a scientist or even an atheist could agree with.
Right.
The death is the cessation of physical life.
But it doesn't take into account that there may be a theological definition to words.
Now, what I learned pretty early in our departure from the Watchtower was that the Christendom's teachers did methodical Bible study. And I tripped across a new rule I didn't know before that several famous teachers used over the centuries. And it's called the law or the rule of first use. That the first time you trip over a term or a word or a concept in the Bible, generally its practical use, its permanent use, its larger frame of reference is in the first reference. So, for instance, here in chapter 2, you have the name Yahweh, Jehovah, revealed for the first time.
In Genesis.
And when you read the context, you realize why the name Jehovah here and not in chapter 1, for instance, and not later in the Bible either, as we discovered in the Daniel series. It's because of the thing you now know about this name that you didn't know before when you were a Jehovah's Witness, when it was just a label that God had, that you had to publicize. So we've talked about that in another series, so check out the series 66 Books You Should Not Read if you want to remain a Jehovah's Witness, where we expand upon this idea of the first use of Jehovah in this text, chapter 2. But in the same chapter, chapter 2 of Genesis, you have the first use of the word death.
Okay.
So it's worthwhile for us to read what God says in his very first reference to death, from his own mouth to the first human beings.
Okay. It's verses 15 to 17. And Jehovah God proceeded to take the man and settle him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to take care of it. And Jehovah God also laid this command upon the man: From every tree of the garden you may eat to satisfaction, but as for the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat from it. For in the day you eat from it, you will positively die.
So when you're a witness, what are you going to do with this? Well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But the point is, what does it actually say? God is speaking to the first human beings and saying, the day you eat of the tree, disobey me, you will positively die. Right. And if you know how this story plays out in the next chapter,
right,
what does the serpent say to Eve?
You will not die.
You positively will not die. So if you take the Watchtower definition of death, the cessation of biological or physical activities, the loss of consciousness and the cessation of biological activity, to this text.
Yeah. Who ends up being the truth teller?
Who is telling the truth? Because the next day they will know whether the serpent or God is correct.
Telling the truth. So if you define it the way the Watchtower does, who is the truth teller?
So what's the Watchtower's out here?
Well, they will say, oh, but the scriptures tell us that a day to Jehovah is 1,000 years. But the problem with that is, did Eve know that? Did Adam know that? Did their children know that? When they do die, did any of them know this?
That thought is in a couple of places in the Bible, Psalm 90, for instance, and it's in 2 Peter, the one I used to use.
Right.
But the point is, they didn't have Psalm 90 or 2 Peter. So where did their explanation of what this meant conform to the fact? Right. The only death they would be aware of, even if you're a witness, you think the death they were aware of is the death of animals, so physical death. But they didn't die the same day, physically.
So what would they have believed as years went by? According to that definition, they believed Satan was the one that told them the truth.
No, there are probably a few people now shaking their heads as they watch this video saying, well, no, you're making too much of it. But I think this definition of death, that something happened that day, is explained in the very text itself. Let's just say it's not proved, it's explained, or it's hinted at as to what God means by death.
Right. Because
what do they do when they're conscious of sin for the first time? What is their response to this new consciousness?
Which happens when they eat. They eat of the fruit and they suddenly become conscious. And then it says that they realized they were naked. That always sort of threw me as a witness. I would think, well, what, they didn't know before that they didn't have any clothes? It just didn't seem to make any sense to me.
The rabbis, interesting, I didn't find this out till after I started researching Genesis. The rabbis had an interesting explanation for this. They say the reason they didn't know they were naked is because before sin, before the fall, they glowed with the glory of God. Of course you're not conscious of your physical being if you're glowing with the glory of God. Now wait, I'm not saying I believe that, but they believe that because they said, well, how would they be conscious of their nakedness? And so their explanation is something physical changed, something tangible changed. Whether you believe that or not, the point is they were conscious of a separation that didn't exist before.
They knew something had changed. Their relationship with God had definitely changed. And then they are separated physically from God when they're thrown out of the garden.
Now even the Watchtower acknowledges that. They will say, well, they knew they were sinners and they were going to die. So they were dying already. And the human condition now is that we're all conscious that we're going to die. So we're dying. But God seems to call that here death. When you separate yourself from Him, you are dead, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, you have no relationship with the life giver anymore. So if you view it that way, then it's true. God is true. God is vindicated.
Yeah. Yes. If that's what it meant to them, separation from God, then God underlines that by expelling them from the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
He doesn't end their physical life, but He expels them from His presence officially.
Yeah.
So in the next segment, we want to talk about whether the New Testament conforms to this idea of what death is. And so we'll go to Jesus' own words in the Gospel of John, and then in a later segment, let's see what Paul has to say about this.
Right.